But the United States changed, and they changed the laws and regulations that now allowed me to come in and be a free American. And I chose to be an American citizen.
Thank you. Egg Harbor Township, we're back to you.
And we're back to Justin.
You said that when you were in Germany a few years ago that you sensed some anti-Semitism. Did you ever sense that in England or the United States at any given time?
Yes and no. The anti-Semitism that I felt in England was more of a resentment to not, it was it being our fault that England was at war. I don't know that that was the case in the United States. The anti-Semitism that I felt in the United States was an anti-Semitism that was not based on any kind of war effort. I don't think the United States felt that they were fighting for Jews, whereas the British did. I think the United States felt that it was fighting a war of justice. And England was more of a mindset that they were fighting for Jews.
Thank you. You talked about these other countries that wouldn't let you in when you were refused entry in Cuba. But one thing you haven't talked about was, do you feel that the Nazi government played any part in your not being admitted once you got to Cuba, or was that totally the decision of the Cubans?
No, absolutely. The Nazi government had already planted their own personnel in the government of Cuba, and it was a carefully laid plot to convince the president of Cuba not to allow the Jews in, and they did it to show the world that they were doing the world a favor by eliminating Jews. So the Nazi government had planned this trip very carefully by forewarning the Cuban government not to allow us entry. It was not a haphazard kind of decision.
Thank you. Radner, do you have another question for Mrs. Weiner?
How many people on the St. Louis went back to England?
Approximately 230 people went to England. About 27 passengers, 17 I think it was, now I don't remember the exact figures, actually got off in Cuba. And they got off because they had family who worked for the Cuban government and had special permission to get off the ship. But the rest of the 500, well, it's more than that, 550 some odd people that went to continental Europe, meaning Belgium, France, and Holland, only 10% of those survived the war.
Thank you. Egg Harbor Township, do you have another question?
Got that one right here.
Have you ever met any of the survivors that got off in Cuba? Or initially?
Yes, I have. As a matter of fact, for many years my mother told me I was the youngest child on the ship, but I wasn't. I met a young man who got off in Cuba because his father worked for the Cuban government, and a young boy, he was 2 months younger than I was, and his sister and mother got off in Cuba. I have met them since, when we have had a reunion of St. Louis survivors.
Do any of these other survivors that you've met talk about their experiences to school groups or to community groups the way you do, or that was never a conversation you had with them?
No, some of them do. Some of them speak a lot. As a matter of fact, there's one man who, when he came to the United States after high school, joined the military and became a general in the United States Army, and he's written a book. And there's a young man who was a teenager. Yes, I have it as well. Teenager, I know him very well. He wrote a diary while he was on the ship, and I've met him. He lives in North Jersey.
Okay, so here's one of the diaries that she's referring to. It's called The St. Louis Diary of Fritz Buff, if anyone wants to check that out. What are the other books you're sitting there with, Mrs. Weiner?
Okay, there's a wonderful book that was written by the Holocaust Museum in Washington, D.C. It took 5 years to research, and it's called Refuge Denied, and written tracing all the passengers of the St. Louis and where they ended up. Those that survived England only take up a small portion because England, of course, was on the Allied side, and their chance of survival and our chance in England was the greatest. But it traces all the passengers and where they happened to end up. Some ended up in Australia. Some stayed in Cuba and left when Cuba had an uprising. Some are in Israel, and they're scattered throughout the world.
Okay, we're running out of time, so I'm going to go back to the schools for one final comment. But before I do that, is there a parting message that you have for the students who have shared this hour with you this morning?
Yes, I have one message, and it is a homework assignment that you have to do 20 years from now. And that homework assignment is to tell your family, tell your friends, tell everyone you know about the story of the St. Louis and all other stories that you hear from Holocaust survivors. Because 20 years from now, we will no longer be here to be able to tell our stories. And it is important that we never forget. And your assignment is to pass on that message to the next generation.
I think we'd like to thank Mrs. Weiner very much for joining us this morning. Radner, do you have anything you'd like to say to her as we say goodbye this morning?
Yes, absolutely. We'd like to thank you. I know that you're saying that at first you didn't consider yourself a survivor, but the fact that you were forced from your homeland, that you and your family showed such great courage, not only once, but had to move to England, and then having to move to the United States. I think that not too many of us have been through something like that. And we feel very honored to have heard from you today. And we thank you for opening up your heart and your story to us.
Thank you for listening.
Thank you. Egg Harbor Township, do you have any final goodbyes this morning?
Yes, Mrs. Weiner, thank you so much for sharing your story, and you can guarantee that this crew here, 20 years from now, will have completed their homework assignment because we're putting Chanel in charge. Wave. And nothing escapes that detail. So thank you so much for sharing with us.
Thank you very much to all of you for joining us this morning, and we hope that you learned that you need to be accepting of people no matter what their differences are from you. So have a nice day. Eva, can you still hear me?
I can.
Okay,
We have no
thank you.
We have no technicians in the room, so I don't know what we're doing.
Well, I just wanted to thank you very much. Of course, you did a wonderful job. And it looks like both of the schools